When I started my journalism career, I definitely thought in a more simplistic fashion. I thought that if something bad happened, then bad people knowingly set out to do bad things. And I think having this experience with Enron early in my career was very formative because I remember thinking that when I called up Enron, former Enron people after the bankruptcy, I'd be able to get them on the phone and say, all right, how'd you do it? How'd you, commit the fraud in your division? And, maybe reluctantly they'd tell me. And much to my surprise, most of the people who worked at Enron didn't have a clue. They didn't look up from the things they were doing every day to see how the pieces were or weren't fitting together. Many of them had bought into the culture of the company, as I think we all do. There's an osmotic effect, right, to working somewhere. And even at the highest levels of the company, they were believers too, at least in some fashion. And I think I got a firsthand sort of lesson in the human power of rationalization and self-delusion. And I remember struggling with that a lot and saying to a close friend, I don't know how to think about this because Jeff Skilling, he believed. And my friend said to me, Bethany, the worst crimes in human history have been committed by people who believed. So when I say people believed, I don't mean it as an excuse necessarily, but it's an explanation, and it's at the core. All stories of business are stories of human nature, and that's what makes them so interesting. They're Shakespearean stories of flaws and attributes just played out on a grand stage, right? Played out on the stage of business. Definitely an obsession with the stock price and an obsession with meeting quarterly earnings targets, and perhaps a social media obsession nowadays are all signs of an executive who cares more about perception than about the reality of his or her business. I think in entrepreneur land, a sense of grandeur of this thing that I am doing is the most important thing in the entire world. In corporate land, there have been a number of collapses that have been precipitated by the executive saying, I want us to be the greatest company on earth. Enron said that. Valiant at one point had a goal of being the biggest pharmaceutical company by market cap. When you hear executives start to get very grandiose in their pronouncements, I think that's a sign. I think sanctimony is an interesting sign. A refusal to listen to critics or an inability to handle criticism is interesting. Yeah, and the list probably goes on. But it's interesting in the case of Wells Fargo, you look back to this story in Forbes that celebrated Wells Fargo as the bank that gets it all right. And you listen to John Stumpf, the CEO, and the way he talked about how there was no dissent on the executive floor because they all just got along and everything was so nice. And you look back and think that Pollyanna-ish view is a sign of something rotten underneath. One thing I've noticed in all of these years is that what a company or an executive says and what they actually do can be very different. And the more grandiose a company's code of conduct is, the more flowery. And Enron's actually literally was flowery. It had a giant flower printed on it. The more suspicious you should be.